All right, Derry.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to today's EPA Alumni Association Academy program, which is entitled A Tale of Two Rivers, the Potomac River and the Rio Grande, How Public Action Can Protect Local Rivers. Thank you for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be an exciting discussion with two of our distinguished EPA alumni, Nancy Stoner and Miguel Flores. I also want to give a special shout out to some current EPA staff who are watching today as our guests. Nobody understands and appreciates your work better than EPA alumni do. I'm Derry Allen, and I'm pleased to be moderating this program along with my fellow EPA Alumni Association board member, Carl Edlund. Our subject today is how people are working to protect two of America's most iconic rivers, the Potomac River and the Rio Grande. Though different in many ways, these two efforts shine a light on how the public can make a crucial difference in enhancing the health of our local rivers and that of communities through which they flow. Wherever you are, you're probably near a river. We can locate ourselves by watershed. On the surface today, our discussion is about two rivers, but there is an intentionally strong undercurrent about how members of the public can protect local rivers anywhere. In this way, we hope that this program will not only inform members of the association about a topic of common interest, but also identify opportunities for members to engage in environmental problem solving. Along the way, we also hope to enhance the sense of community among EPA alumni. This is one of a series of programs that's being organized and presented by the EPA Alumni Association Academy for and by EPA alumni. We can talk more about future Academy programs at the end of this session. I should, however, give proper credit to Nancy Stoner, who's offered some months ago to do a Zoom presentation about the Potomac River for EPA alumni, helped spur us to create the Academy and this series of programs. So thank you, Nancy, for helping us in that way. Carl, you want to pick it up from here?
Yeah, Derry, thanks. Yeah, you know, as you mentioned, every watershed has unique problems and opportunities, and the idea of contrasting these two river systems was to be able to provide people with the ideas about maybe things that might work on their watershed. So we asked Nancy and Miguel to target their presentations for about 15 or 20 minutes to allow for a Q&A session at the end. If you're going to have questions, we suggest you use the chat function on your Zoom machine, and we'll try to pick them up at the end of the discussions. Finally, there's an unusual format here where we're going to try to give focus to Nancy and Miguel with these images. If you want the regular plain view, you can adjust that on your toolbar at the top of your monitor. So with that, we'll end up with a chat session at the end of these discussions, but those will be for informal discussions, not to further drill on Nancy and Miguel. So with that, Derry, why don't I turn it back to you?
Okay, thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Stoner. Nancy is well known to many EPA alumni. She's worked at EPA twice, first in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and second as deputy and then acting assistant administrator for water. She's been working to protect the environment in various capacities since she joined the U.S. Justice Department as a trial attorney after law school. Nancy grew up in the Shenandoah River watershed in Virginia, which flows into the Potomac. She attended the University of Virginia by the Rivanna River, a tributary of the James River. She earned her JD at Yale Law School near three small rivers, the West River, the Mill River, and the Quinnipiac River, all of which flow into the New Haven Harbor on Long Island Sound. Today, she is president of the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. This network mobilizes citizens to protect the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers and their tributaries. Best of all, Nancy is a wonderful person and full of enthusiasm for what she does. Nancy?
Thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be with all of you today. I see lots of old friends and colleagues on the guest list here today, and I look forward to having an opportunity to meet a few more of you in the breakout later. And so I want to thank you for joining this event. And I'm delighted to be one of the first speakers of this new series. So thank you so much for setting it up. If you will pull up the first slide there. Okay, so as Darian Carl just told you, we're going to talk about the Potomac and the Rio Grande. So the next slide. I'm going to start by showing you, hopefully, a beautiful picture of the Potomac. There you go. This is upstream. Oh, there's the first one. Upstream from DC in this area called the Potomac Gorge. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is what a fantastic resource the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers are, how lucky we are to have these beautiful rivers right near DC and a heavily urbanized area. But also the beautiful mountains and where the watershed starts. But it's a mixed picture, and that's what I'm going to talk about, is the beauty of these rivers and then also the pollution problems that we still face. You can see there's some boats over on the right. There's some people enjoying the Potomac. It's a big watershed, so almost 15,000 square miles. It's an American heritage river, which means, of course, that the Potomac has lots of history to it, as well as its environmental and ecological values. And it's in DC, Maryland, Virginia, a little bit in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The next slide, please. So the first thing I want to show you is the map of the watershed. So EPA people are probably pretty familiar with watersheds, but for those of you who weren't in the water program, a watershed is the area that all drains to a particular point. Here we're talking about where the Potomac drains into the Chesapeake Bay, but it does start up in the mountains of West Virginia and in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I am from Waynesboro, which is a little town too small to be on the map there, but it's I grew up right along the South River, which flows into the Shenandoah, which again joins with the upper Potomac to form the Potomac River. And that's really part of the story about how I'm in this group. When they first talked to me about this group, they said it was protecting the Potomac River. And I said, that's an interesting group, good to know about it. And they said, and it also protects the Shenandoah. And I said, well, that's the group for me. That's where I've been living my whole life in the waters that I have always had the opportunity to enjoy. We have three river keepers, one for the upper Potomac, one for the Shenandoah, and one for the Potomac. The rivers meet in Harpers Ferry, and that's also the boundary of the jurisdiction of the river keepers. The next slide, please. So I'm going to talk very quickly. This is a condensed history here. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Potomac as it relates particularly to the Clean Water Act and the restoration of the Potomac. So I love this little picture in the middle, and I often show it. I know some of you have heard me speak before, and I always show this picture because it's such a charming picture. The police officer there is measuring the length of the swimsuits to see what the distance is between the bottom of the swimsuit and the top of the knee. So it's very picturesque point in time. But what's important from our standpoint is the vision of a swimmable Potomac. So here in 1922, these folks are at the tidal basin. You can see the Washington Monument behind them. This is a beach, a swimming beach on the Potomac River in DC. So that's our vision of where we want to get back to. That's where we want to go. We had it before, we want to get it again. So the picture on the right is pretty much the low point. The 60s and the 70s were pretty much the low point of the Potomac River. This is actually in Georgetown, that's Watergate. So in 1973, when this picture was taken, there was a lot going on at Watergate. But what's important for our purposes here is that this is a combined sewer overflow, and the Potomac at that time was filled with sewage, with dead fish, with trash, with algae. We still have some of all of that in the river, but it looks a heck of a lot better now than it did then. And one of the main reasons is because of the Federal Clean Water Act and how we've used that. We collectively, certainly including EPA, have used that to protect rivers and clean up rivers across the United States. The next slide, please. Oh, I thought it was the same picture. No, it's a new picture, and it's another beautiful picture of the Potomac and the Potomac Gorge. So these programs, again, very familiar to EPA people. Your work has been incredibly important to the cleanup and restoration of the Potomac and Shenandoahs, as it has with rivers across the United States. You got to start with the construction grants program, building those sewage treatment plants and upgrading them. The NPDES program, or the
if you need me, I'll come up. I've got about 5 minutes to get another speaker speaking.
The industrial discharge program, that's the program that controls discharges of pollutants from point sources or discrete conveyances. The stormwater program, there's several parts to it, but basically controlling pollutants that are mobilized by stormwater into waterways. That program is increasingly difficult to implement as climate change makes storm sizes larger. And then in this area, we have the Chesapeake Bay program, which is a funding program that has been generously funded by Congress for many years to help pay for improvements in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Next slide, please. So let me just tell you a minute about how the Potomac Riverkeeper Network works and how we use these programs. So as it says there, our mission is to protect everyone's right to clean water in the Potomac, the Shenandoah, and the tributaries. And we do that primarily by stopping pollution. We do assessment, we do advocacy, and we do enforcement. We follow the science to figure out what the solutions are, and then we figure out how to bring those to the watershed, whether it's through enforcement, passing a law, or other kinds of advocacy that we can do, organizing, and so forth. A river keeper is a watchdog for the river. They're the experts in the river. They're the spokesman for the river, or spokesperson for the river. And what they do, again, is gather the science. So you see there on the left, you see the Shenandoah Riverkeeper getting a water quality sample. In the middle, you see our research vessel, which is called Sea Dog. It was given to us by a retired 4-star admiral in the Navy who wanted us to use his family's personal boat to protect the river. That's where our water quality monitoring lab is. And on the right, you see the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper, Brent Walls. He is flying a drone. He is the nation's expert in using drones to detect and document sources of pollution so they can be cleaned up. So it's boots on the ground, boats in the water, drones in the air. That's how we operate at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Next slide, please. So we were not formed until 2000. So a lot of that great work to clean up the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers under the Clean Water Act happened before we were created. And we were created to create a stronger advocacy voice for clean water in this watershed. So there were already great groups doing a lot of good conservation work, preservation work, land trusts. and so forth, like our sister organization, the Potomac Conservancy. But there was a feeling among people that we needed someone who would be a stronger advocate and help to enforce the law. And that's why we were formed. And that's what we've been doing ever since. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. But I wanted to also mention that in 2019, after I joined the organization, we went through a strategic planning process. And one of the things that we did was to adopt a strong commitment to pursuing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our staff, in our board, and in our program to ensure that we are bringing clean water to everyone in the watershed, and we all can benefit from that. One of the things I've always liked about working on rivers and lakes and water resources is that they belong to the public. They are our resources and they are free if we use them. So that's a great thing to have everyone be able to enjoy. Next slide, please. I talked about a little of this already. This is the Shenandoah Riverkeeper patrolling. Patrolling is one of the things we do that differentiates us from other environmental groups that work mostly out of their offices. We have offices too, but we are out on the water documenting problems and also investigating when others report problems to us. In fact, we're expanding our ability to do that through creating rapid response teams in a new initiative this spring. So we want to be able to, if you see something that smells bad or looks bad or a discharge that shouldn't be there, we want to be able to investigate that, figure out where the pollution's coming from, and stop it. And as I said, we use science to inform what we do. We're not just looking for problems, we're looking for problems and solutions. Ways that we can address the problem and clean up the river so you and we can all enjoy it. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a couple of examples. So most people on here probably know about combined sewer overflows. That's where you have the sewage and the stormwater in the same set of pipes and it overflows when it rains. We have those in DC and in Alexandria. Stormwater, of course, that's what you get from rain hitting pavement and carrying everything on the surface of the pavement into the waterway. So the photo on the left you might be looking at and saying, that's not a very good photo. And in fact, you're right. It's not a very good photo in a lot of ways. It's not very clear, but it is a compelling photo in this way. So Dean Nyax, who's your Potomac Riverkeeper, and he's the guy also with the mask on the right, was out near the Bellhaven Marina last summer with his wife and his daughter. They were doing stand-up paddleboarding. It was not raining, but it had recently been raining. And they saw this huge river of pollution flowing toward them from a combined sewer overflow nearby. This is what it looked like. He and his family grabbed their stand-up paddleboards. They ran out of the water as fast as they could go, and he turned around and snapped this picture. So I tell you this because combined sewer overflows, why they are antiquated in the sense that they were created a long time ago, they still exist. This problem still exists today in the Potomac rivers. So the Alexandria and DC are both under obligations to fix these problems, but they have not yet completed that work, and we want to make sure that it happens. So raising awareness about that is definitely one of the things we're doing. Just quickly on the right, this is Dean out on I-66 where they were doing construction during the pandemic, which I guess is not over yet, but we're getting there. We had our riverkeepers out doing inspections and responding to complaints. Even while governmental people were not allowed to do so, we had our riverkeepers doing it and doing it in ways where they would be safe doing so. And look at the mess out there on I-66. So he reported it to the state of Virginia, and they came and they brought an enforcement action to fix it. Next slide, please. I think you probably know most of this. The sign, of course, is a sign that says there's combined sewer overflows at that location. This is a sign a photo I took myself down at the Georgetown waterfront, the same area where you see kayakers and stand-up paddleboarders out there all the time. That's where you have sewer overflows. That problem is supposed to be solved by 2030, and we are very much engaged in making sure that it happens. And what you can do as an individual is support those investments that need to be made. The technology exists to store and treat that combined sewage and stormwater, as you probably know, but we need to invest to make that happen. And we support those investments and encourage you to do so as well. Next slide, please. So part of what we do is to do water quality monitoring. So people will know, particularly for the E. coli bacteria that people are concerned about. They're concerned about whether if they go in the water, they will get sick with gastroenteritis, diarrhea and vomiting. So we started a water quality monitoring program to gather information during the recreational season. We gather it weekly. We focus on public access points. And we put that information each week on a computer program or app called Swim Guide. It's a waterkeeper developed tool. It's very easy to use. And if you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to download it and take a look. And it's not perfect because if you, it takes a day to incubate the samples and so forth. So it's not perfect, but it's much better than the information that was available before, which was once a year from the governmental authorities here locally. So we put that information out there. It gives you a pretty good sense actually of which areas generally are safe to swim and which are not, based on what we've seen in the first 2 years. We did run that program last summer. During the pandemic, you see our lawyer there with his dog. We put our staff out to collect the water quality samples when we couldn't use volunteers last summer. And what do we want to do? We want to lift the swim ban in DC that was put in place in the 1970s when it was never safe to swim. Now it's safe to swim quite often according to those criteria. We want to lift the ban so you can swim unless they tell you not to swim. And as I said, we want to support cost-effective investments that will address this problem. Just on the right there, we did put out a report last year about the results of the water quality monitoring as part of our Swimmable Potomac campaign. And the photo you'll see is of Shark Fest. So we don't have sharks in the Potomac, but this program was started out in San Francisco Bay at Alcatraz. And we do support an open water swim by this organization. We will have it in September of this year. And we do it in conjunction with this organization to support the Special Olympics. We had about 100 people 2 years ago. It was canceled last year because of COVID. Next slide, please. And we have a new project called the 50 Million Mussel Project. So as I said, the stormwater problem is a very significant, difficult problem to control. It's hard to make a built environment function like a natural environment in terms of hydrology or the ability to absorb and filter out pollution. Well, mussels can help. So there are freshwater mussels that are native to the Potomac River that we have started a project to restore. We did a pilot project last year. The mussels did well. And we want to get 50 million of them in there ultimately to filter the pollution. They capture it in their bodies. These are not mussels that you eat, so they stay there, but the toxins and other pollutants stay in the body of the mussel, and they reproduce. So we wouldn't actually have to put in 50 million. We just put in enough to get them to reproduce. And the ability to do this has been enhanced because of the improvements in water quality. If it's too polluted or they're covered by sediment, they don't reproduce. But they, so far, prospects look very good, and we intend to ramp up on this in both National Harbor and the wharf this year. Next slide, please. So another of the tough problems in our watershed, and this is particularly true in the Shenandoah, is agriculture. So as you probably know, if you're an expert in the Clean Water Act, the agricultural pollution is probably the most poorly controlled through the Federal Clean Water Act. And for example, we have almost 200 million birds raised every year at concentrated animal feeding operations in the Shenandoah, but none of them are required to have a Federal Clean Water Act permit. So 200 million birds and no federal permits. Fortunately, there are some state laws, and I can mention that a little bit more as we go through. We use whatever we have. We can use the federal law if it exists. If there isn't one, we enforce a state law. If there isn't a state law, we try to pass one. So, so that's what we're doing on agriculture. But this is the biggest problem. You see here herds of cattle right next to recreational users. It has been, and in fact still is, lawful to put your herd of cattle in the Shenandoah River right near a public access point. But there is a state law that enables us to work with the state and with farmers to fence out those cattle if they're causing a pollution problem, which pretty much they always are if you have a herd of cattle in the water. And so that's what we do. We've gotten about 80% of the cattle out, fenced out of the river so far. I noticed that Alan Lehman, who is our project manager, is on the video this afternoon. He's the one that's been doing that good work in a boat, very detailed, time-intensive work. And we got some good help from the Virginia General Assembly that passed a deadline for fencing cattle out to help clean up the bay. And that's the end of 2025. Those two problems, the poultry and the cattle together, cause the algae that you see on the right. This is very thick filamentous algae that is not compatible with people's use and enjoyment or wildlife, because it sucks all the air out, among other things. The next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, the Federal Clean Water Act hasn't helped us very much in the Shenandoah. But we do have state laws. We have the Agricultural Stewardship Act, which is the one that enables us to report uncovered poultry litter piles and also the herds of cattle, so that we can get them out of the river and to stop the pollution in the river. There also is a poultry permitting scheme at the state level that we've had some good luck working with the state on. This past year, they closed a big loophole that allowed farmers to ship the poultry litter offsite and essentially no longer be required to keep track of it. And then, as it says at the bottom, we work with the legislature every year to make sure there are cost share dollars to help farmers implement these management practices. We are not anti-farmers, we're not anti-agriculture, we're anti-pollution. So we want to have the farmers have the tools that they need and the funding that they need and deserve in order to clean up these pollution problems. Next slide, please. So we call the campaign in the Shenandoah the Respect the Shenandoah campaign, and the goal there, eliminate nuisance algal outbreaks in the Shenandoah. And we do it by public engagement. We want you out there with us, identifying where there is nuisance algae, identifying where there are herds of cattle, identifying where there are other hazards like the uncovered poultry litter piles, and reporting them to us, which you can call a hotline to do that, or you can report them using a tool that we promote called Water Reporter. Again, it's a smartphone app, very easy to use and report, and the report comes right to us, and we work with the state to address it. The bottom point is an important one. So we are very pleased that Virginia has decided to do a new water quality standard for algae. We've been trying to get the Shenandoah listed as impaired for many years. We brought unsuccessful litigation to do that. It's very hard to get a water body listed as impaired if there's no water quality standard in place. So after that litigation was over, Virginia DEQ announced that they were going to do a water quality standard for algae, chlorophyll A standard. So we are thrilled that they're doing that, and we are participating actively in that process to make sure that it will protect the river. Next slide, please. Another example of what we're working on is coal ash. So this is one that's probably familiar to a lot of the EPA people, whether they're in the RCRA program or the Clean Water Act program, because those two work together to address coal ash. The water program more for active power plants, and the RCRA program for coal ash ponds that are no longer at active discharges. What you see, the picture at the left there is Possum Point. That's near Dumfries in Northern Virginia. And the pond that you see on the top right of the picture, that's a coal ash pit. So it's filled with the remainder after you burn the coal to generate power. You'll notice right on the other side, the little barrier there is the Potomac River. So state of the art has been until very recently that you take the ash out, you dump it in a big pit like this, add water, and then you let it leach into the drinking water, into the groundwater, and into the river. And that's what was happening at this point and at some others in the Potomac River. So EPA has been working to address this problem. It hasn't completed that process yet, still a little fluid at the federal level, but we didn't wait. So we worked with the state of Virginia to get legislation passed that requires that the coal ash, instead of being put in a pit and adding water, either made into concrete or safely recycled in concrete or cement, and or put in a landfill that is lined and has leachate protection system associated with it, like a hazardous waste landfill. So we got that through the Virginia General Assembly, which we're very pleased about. We also worked with Maryland on the active plants there to get limitations on the discharges of toxins from these coal ash pits into the waterways. We work there with Ben Grumbles, many of you may know, who runs the environmental agency there. And the power plants have sued, but we're on the same side as Maryland and working with the AG's office there. And so far we've been successful working with them. So I want to thank my friend Ben Grumbles on that. Next slide. And then another issue we're working on that has not really been addressed yet at the federal level is PFAS. Probably a number of you have worked on it or are working on that. These are forever chemicals. These are chemicals that are used for a lot of, they're very useful chemicals. They are used for firefighting. They're used on non-stick surfaces, but they are toxic and they stay in the environment once they're created. So we've been gathering science about them. That's what we've been doing so far, is to do sampling, to do analysis. And then we're working with Maryland and the legislature there to phase out the use of these in some products. That's what we're doing on PFAS. Next. So our strategy on toxins, like other things, is gather the science, figure out where the pollution's coming from, what are the tools that we can use to address them. I was maybe a little short on PFAS, but part of the reason is there aren't any standards yet. So there's no standards at the federal level, and we don't have standards in our state yet. So we're working to develop the science necessary to support standards, and then also, as I said, phasing out uses so that we have less of them created, because once you create them, it's very hard to get rid of them. This is Dean Nyox, again, your Potomac Riverkeeper. He's in front of the Morgantown plant by the 301 bridge, for those of you who are familiar with it. That's another plant that burns coal and has coal ash pits. And it has announced that it's going to shut down. One of the things about getting these coal burning plants to start dealing with their coal ash wastes and other kinds of pollution that they cause, they internalize those costs, and then they become less competitive with other renewable sources of energy that, of course, better from a climate standpoint. Next slide. So I'm gonna leave it at that. This is a pretty simple message here on this slide, but sometimes the Potomac River looks like that situation on the bottom left. You see pollution, you see algae, and so forth. And sometimes it looks like that beautiful photo on the right. And both of them are the river that we love. And we just want to move from the left to the right. That's our vision. Stop the pollution and restore and reclaim that river. Last slide, please. Oh, no, there's a couple more. So how can you get involved? Hopefully you're saying at this point, I definitely want to get involved. I want to help clean up the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, but I also want to enjoy them. So the first thing you can do is enjoy them by going out with us on an event. We have a series of events called River Palooza events. That, as it says, they're tubing, rafting, kayaking, fishing, all kinds of events. We want people out and enjoy the beautiful places that we know. We'll share those with you. And sometimes they have cultural components to them, historical components to them. They're really fantastic. We didn't have any of them last summer, so we're really anxious to get out there and enjoy the beautiful rivers that we work to protect. And then we have one event so far that's focused on Spanish speakers called Rio Palooza. Everything is in English and Spanish, and we have all kinds of fun things. It's not even just all on the river. We have forest bathing, we have fishing, we have snorkeling, we have music, we have food. What a great event. It's in September this year, and I hope you can come. And one more slide. So the other things you can do, I've mentioned a couple of them already. You can help us with the water quality monitoring program. We use volunteers to collect the samples, do the analysis, and so forth. You can help us with a stream cleanup. We had a big one at Oxen Cove this year, huge cleanup, but we have some at National Harbor and Alexandria Waterfront. We're also going to do stand-up paddleboard cleanups this spring down at the Bellhaven Marina. And then I mentioned the rapid response team. You can help us respond to pollution complaints that people call in about. And last slide. So here's my message, pretty simple. The Potomac watershed, it's worth saving. It's a beautiful watershed. We can do it. We can do it together. And I thank you for joining me for this presentation. That's my contact information at the left, and the website. That's my phone number. This is a small group, so I'm happy to talk to you. If you want to get in touch with me and give me ideas or ask how you can get involved, I'd be happy to talk to any of you. I love EPA people. I really enjoyed working with them and enjoy working with them still. So let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's back to Carl again, and I'm going to introduce Miguel. But first, I'd like to let you all know that both of these presentations will be posted on our website, and they'll be available for you to go back and look at more detail. There's a lot of information packed into these slides and the notes and all, and so they'll be available for everybody. We are recording this as well too, so we'll have that record. Let me talk a little bit about Miguel Flores. Miguel was born on the banks of the Rio Grande in Laredo, Texas. So his passion for the river has really been a lifelong pursuit. So he started with the EPA Region 6 in 1975, working on air monitoring, air modeling, standard setting, and permitting. He left EPA in 1984 to work for the National Park Service, where he led the integration of EPA and National Park Service air monitoring networks. And he came back to Region 6 in 2002 as a member of the Senior Executive Service, became our Water Division Director, where he really was involved with multi-billion-dollar water programs throughout the Southwest. With respect to the Rio Grande, and I think he'll talk a little bit about this, Miguel led binational programs to synchronize the US and Mexico water programs and involved the states of Texas and New Mexico, and Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas in Mexico. So Miguel retired from EPA in 2011. He now lives in Denver. And I should mention also that his resume is also included in the invitation to this meeting. So if you wanted to look up more information. So Miguel, can you tell us a little bit about the Rio Grande?
Sure. Thanks, Carl. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's very good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to the board for the invitation, and hello to everyone out there, especially those from Region 6 with whom I worked with for many years. As Carl mentioned, I was born in the city of Laredo. I really wasn't born on the banks of the river, just, but in Laredo. Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, which is across the river, is one of 7 sister cities along the Texas-Mexico border, where most border residents reside. You know, with respect, I guess I better show my screen then. There we go. Sorry about that. You know, Will Rogers once said about the Rio Grande that it was the only river I know of that is in need of irrigating, which really is a prophetic observation considering how fragmented this fabled river has become. Let me talk a little bit about the river and the watershed. It's the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo in Mexico, as it is known. But the Rio Grande is the 4th longest river in North America, the 3rd in the U.S. Headwaters are up in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, 12,000 feet above sea level. And it forms 1,250 miles of the Texas-Mexico border. The watershed is expansive. It's 336 square miles, binational watershed, of course, about 50-50 in terms of how much is in each country. It is, in Mexico, it is the largest watershed, and it includes the 200,000 square mile Chihuahuan Desert. I want to point out that Rio Conchos, if I can see it here, and then these 2 international reservoirs that are on the river. The Rio Conchos provides most of the water. It comes in just upriver of Big Bend National Park. And most of the water that is in the river is from the Rio Conchos, from Mexico. You do get some from the Pecos River and a little bit from the Devils, but most of the water comes from the Rio Conchos that flows down. These 2 reservoirs were part of the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico regarding the allocation of waters of the river, and these are important for storage for municipalities as well as for agriculture. The terrain is mostly arid and semi-arid, but it has a lot of geographic and ecological diversity. It's an endangered river. World Wildlife Fund has designated as one of the most endangered rivers in the world, and American Rivers has designated it as an endangered river here in the United States. Just want to give you a glimpse in terms of the diversity that I just mentioned from upstream in Colorado. If you focus on the middle, Colorado flowing through Albuquerque all the way down to the Brownsville, where it empties into the Gulf. Now, sometimes it doesn't empty into the Gulf because there's a big sandbar that forms there because of the lack of flow and enough to push the sand away. But notice how at El Paso sometimes the river runs dry, and the river is essentially a culvert because of the realignment of the U.S.-Mexico border as a result of the meander of the Rio Grande. You can see the scenery in Big Bend National Park and Chihuahuan Desert. On either side of the middle are some of the critters that you find along the river. Now, I've had encounters with each one of those with the exception of the ocelot. The Mexican black bear, by the way, came over to Big Bend from the Maderos del Carmen, the Sierras in Mexico. And I should add that it came across illegally. Here's more of the diversity that you see, particularly in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Because it is the convergence of 2 major flyways, you will see some tropical bird species that you don't see anywhere else in the United States. Turning to environmental, water quality, and public health issues, you'll see here a variety of things that cause issues with the Rio Grande, from outhouses or privies to direct discharges into the river, inoperable infrastructure, and sanitary systems overflows. I just want to point out this Colonia housing. Those are settlements that crop up on the Texas-Mexico border and elsewhere. And these colonias have lack basic sanitary services, sometimes electricity, paved roads, and sometimes, and substandard living conditions. According to the Secretary of State, there's over 1,000 colonias along the Texas-Mexico border with a population, and I was surprised by this, 500,000. As a result of that, you end up with water quality impairments on the river, and you can see that in 2008, the entire stretch of the river from El Paso to the Gulf was impaired for bacteria, and you had some issues with respect to salinity here just upstream of Big Bend National Park. But there have been some improvements with the exception of salinity, which has increased, and it's a big concern for agricultural users. But bacteria has improved. I want to talk now about the Border Water Infrastructure Program. In 1994, NAFTA was enacted, and it created two binational institutions, the Border Environmental Cooperation Commission, or the BEC, which does the planning and design of infrastructure projects, and the North American Development Bank, or the NADBank, which does the financing and construction oversight. Also in 1994, that's when EPA created this Border Water Infrastructure Program, and it provides grants through the NADBank for communities on both sides of the Rio Grande. In Mexico, the big funder of infrastructure projects is the National Water Commission. On the photo there, you see the proud mayors of the towns of Nuevo Laredo and Laredo, along with, of course, the U.S. congressman from the area and the U.S. consul. But it's displaying the $5.8 million EPA grant that went to the city of Nuevo Laredo for a sewer collector line that will prevent over 1 million gallons per day of raw sewage being emptied into the Rio Grande. Just an example of some of the projects that we funded in Region 6. Point this out, many colonial residents do not have potable water, so they drive miles to fill up large water tanks to bring home so that they can have some potable water for their use. Now, here's some of the results from that Border Environmental Infrastructure Program that I talked about. If we focus down at the bottom, you can see how the Border Environmental Infrastructure Fund provided 36% of the $1.2 billion in total project cost that benefited more than 4 million people along the border. And as a result of these projects, it prevented the discharge of 273 million gallons per day of previously untreated wastewater. But focusing on the graph now, you can see that with respect to treated water, that there have been some improvements, and it's about equivalent to what's in Mexico, the entire country. But the dramatic increase in wastewater treatment is what I want to point out, going from 17% all the way to 92%, far exceeding what Mexico has, throughout the country. And those figures are inflated because it does include the border states, which has much more wastewater treatment. Here are some of the environmental health drivers that you will see along the border. These situations create breeding grounds and promote vector-borne diseases such as dengue fever. There's also many illegal dump sites in Mexico that exist, and on both sides of the border, you have millions of tires that are strewn all over the landscape. Here you see some colonias. The next program that I want to talk about, and this is where you have a lot of public participation, is the U.S.-Mexico Border 2020 program, which is another iteration of a program that was established under the 1983 La Paz Agreement between the United States and Mexico. As you can well see, the goals of the program track EPA's goals very closely. Now, as part of the Border 2012 program, I was a co-chair for one of the regional work groups, along with a Mexican counterpart. And we held public meetings to identify what the highest priorities were for communities along the border. What came to the top were household hazardous waste, electronics, and tire collection. Here on the left, you see an effort in Laredo, Mexico, where they collected household hazardous waste and electronics, as well as tires. Here they're being shredded for transport to cement kilns and for other applications. Here's a very clever advertisement for these tire collection efforts. It says, bring 50 tires and we'll give you a bicycle. Just to give you an idea in terms of how successful these programs were, with respect to household hazardous waste, 3 communities alone collected more than 30,000 liters and nearly 26,000 kilograms of waste, inclusive of unused medicines. With respect to used electronics, 3 cities collected more than 1.3 million pounds of used electronics. Here's some, just a few of the things that the Border 2012 and 2020 program fund, because EPA does provide small grants to communities for projects that are highest priority. Here you see, this is actually a bilingual, binational elementary education program on non-point source pollution. Here we funded a water sampling effort for toxics in a lagoon in Mexico next to an oil refinery there. Trash is also a huge problem along the U.S.-Mexico border, and 3 communities alone collected over a few days over 300 tons of trash in these events. We also do a lot of education for children as well as for adults, in particular with respect to asthma and pesticide poisoning, especially for farm workers. We also funded an effort by the Laredo Public Health Director, who is compiling a manual of how to diagnose poisoning, pesticide poisoning, and other poisoning for physicians, because physicians normally don't get that kind of training in medical schools. I want to now turn to some of the challenges that we face along the river with respect to climate change. Within the next 20 years, it is predicted that there will be a 1 to 5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature and a 20% drop in precipitation. Now, this obviously will affect water scarcity and water availability in what is already a water-stressed region. According to the regional water plans that the state mandates, there's going to be a huge demand for water that far exceeds the water that's available, particularly during droughts. Now, in Texas, you have, and in the Southwest, you have severe and exceptional droughts that last as long as 7 3/4 years. Climate change will affect the frequency, duration, and severity, and will likely increase and alter the pattern and intensity of storms, creating heavier rainfall events. And probably more hurricanes like we saw last year entering the Gulf that will dump enormous amount of rain on communities, causing flooding, sewer system overflows, and polluted stormwater runoff. Increased temperatures and droughts will have a serious impact on water quality, like low dissolved oxygen, high pollutant concentrations and salinity, lower flows, and increased water temperatures. Population growth, since the 60s when I grew up in Laredo, The population of Laredo was around 70,000. Today it's 250,000. Unimaginable. But since the 60s, the population along the border has more than doubled. And it's going to increase dramatically over the next 10 to 20 years by, at least 20%, if not more. And by 2070, it's predicted that the population will double. And the 2010 census showed 5.4 million people residing in the border area, and that'll grow within the next 20 years to essentially a little bit over 6 million residents. I talked about water quality and what impacts are going to be as a result of climate change. But with respect to infrastructure, with increased population, infrastructure is always going to lag population growth. So there will be insufficient and strained water and wastewater infrastructure along the Texas-Mexico border. And that will create problems with respect to, obviously, water quality. I'll skip over water rights, but that is a system of how water gets allocated in Texas, where municipalities have priority over irrigation users, and in cases of drought, municipalities trump irrigation water use. Big challenge is transboundary governance. Not only do you have the United States and Mexico dealing with the river, and there's always disputes among the two countries and also between states, because there's state compacts and also conflicts between user groups, both in the United States and in Mexico. Just recently, the Pecos River Compact between New Mexico and Texas was adjudicated by the Supreme Court in favor of New Mexico, because Texas felt that they weren't their fair share of their allocation under the compact. But now that I've given you sort of like a doomsday scenario for the river and the river communities, I want to focus a little bit on some of the local efforts that are going on, particularly those with the Rio Grande Independent Study Center in Laredo, which I support quite a bit. But you see there some of the cleanups that occur along the river. Unheard of that when I was growing up in Laredo, we would never, ever think of swimming in the river because there was raw sewage discharges from Mexico at various outfalls. But now there's kayaking there. I've actually kayaked the river there in Laredo. I've also canoed the lower canyons of Big Bend. But I never, one would never imagine that world famous cellist would come to Laredo and entertain people on the banks of the Rio Grande. You see Mexico in the background. And that to me, that was just amazing. I was floored when I heard that. Here in the middle is the Rio Bosque Wetland Park in El Paso. I had a little bit when I was a river navigator for the Rio Grande American Heritage River. I had a little part in trying to get water into the wetlands. It was amazing how an irrigation canal went right by that park or by the wetlands, but they couldn't get any water into the wetlands because of water rights. So we worked out a deal between El Paso Water Utilities and the irrigators to substitute some purple pipe water into the canal for the ability to flush the wetlands with water so that there wouldn't be an issue with water rights. One of the big things along the river that is a water sampling event that occurs every year. And that the sampling goes all the way from Colorado all the way down to the Gulf along the tributaries. It's binational, so it's done on both sides of the river, tributaries on both sides of the river. well, gone over a little bit, but you can find additional information on the EPA website that I just there. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll be glad to take any of your comments and questions. Paul, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel. That was really great. So I'm wondering whether we have time for questions and answers. Derry, you had some, I had some. Shall we give it a try for a little bit, or when?
Well, here's what I suggest. We're running a little late. I'm gonna, instead of picking one of the ones that I had ready in my back pocket, I'm gonna pick one from just one from the audience. Maybe you want to pick just one from the audience.
Okay.
And then after that, we'll break into the smaller groups. This question is for Nancy, and it says, what are the long-term water quality trends in the Potomac? How is the fish diversity and abundance? And is there a TMDL for the Potomac?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good questions there. So the big things on the horizon, of course, climate and the impacts of climate and how it makes so many of the different problems that we've been addressing worse over time. So I'm sure many of you are working on addressing climate change, and I think that is incredibly important. Urbanization and development and the associated impacts to the waterways, those are very important. The stormwater program is important, but preservation is important too. That's not what my group does, but it's still very important. I encourage you to participate in both of those. I would say that those are the biggest things. And then agriculture it's not a new problem. It's an unaddressed problem largely under the Clean Water Act. And it gets worse as we eat more meat and have more concentrated facilities developing that meat. So there are various different impairments in the Potomac and in the Shenandoah for which there are TMDLs. The big one though, the big driver here, of course, is the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And that's where a lot of the focus is, and that's where a lot of the money is in addressing the nutrient pollution that impairs the Chesapeake Bay. And we have a big hurdle collectively, all of us in the Chesapeake Bay ahead to make the reductions necessary. For example, in Virginia, 72% of the nutrient reductions need to come from agriculture. So that's how the local issues and the larger regional issues come together.
Well,
Carl, you got a thing?
yeah, I'll tell you what, Miguel, I guess I got a question. Does fracking impact the Rio Grande?
The what? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
The fracking, fracturing,
fracking.
does that affect Rio Grande?
Well, yeah, there is some effect. You know, the Eagle Ford shale play area runs northeast to southwest, and it does cover about 3 counties that border the Rio Grande. Now, as of 2017, there's this is a relatively new shale play area. There was 11,000 wells that had been drilled, and each well uses 13 acre feet of water, or 566,000 gallons of water to frack. Now, by 2045, there are projections that there's going to be about 60,000 wells on the upside, which will require 1.3 million acre feet of water, or 34 billion gallons of water. So, you know, since it's groundwater, and this groundwater, you know, very little is recycled, so you're going to have to put it into disposal well, so it's lost forever. So there are, you know, groundwater is connected to the river, so any kind of extraction of water from, you know, groundwater is going to affect the river one way or another, as well as water supplies, particularly for agriculture, who uses a lot of groundwater for their crops.
Well,
Oh, well, thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Nancy, very much. This has been very informative, and I've quite enjoyed it. So,
yeah.
on behalf of all the others, thank you very much, and I applaud you. Before we break into smaller groups so that people can chat socially with each other, I want to say just a word about future programs. In late April or sometime in May, the association will be having its annual meeting. And this year, as we did last year, that meeting will have to be virtual. We will be having a good speaker, and we'll announce all of that when the arrangements have been set. They're not quite set yet. Looking further downstream, we're working on some programs and aspects of science and technology and environmental justice, all with some pretty good speakers that we have in mind. But we welcome suggestions from all of our members, just as we did when Nancy came forward to offer a program on the Potomac River. So if you've got ideas, please let us know. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck Elkins, the association's executive director, who will explain how the transition to our smaller sort of social chat groups will work. Chuck, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And just before I do that, I just remind everybody we have an election going on for the board, and so if you haven't voted yet, please do. So now we're going to turn to the great computer at the Zoom headquarters to automatically and randomly throw you into a breakout room and to have some chance to chat with our colleagues. So I'll see if I can do that here.